Chapter 10 of The Dog Crusoe and His Master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 10. Perplexities. Our hunters planned their escape. Unexpected interruption. The tables turned. Crusoe mounts guard. The escape. Dick Varley sat before the fire ruminating. We do not mean to assert that Dick had been previously eating grass. By no means. For several days past he had been mentally subsisting on the remarkable things that he heard and saw in the Pawnee village, and wondering how he was to get away without being scalped. He was now chewing the cud of this intellectual fare. We therefore repeat emphatically, in case any readers should have presumed to contradict us, that Dick Varley sat before the fire ruminating. Joe Blunt likewise sat by the fire along with him, ruminating too, and smoking besides. Henry also sat there smoking, and looking a little the worse of his late supper. "I don't like the look of things," said Joe, blowing a whiff of smoke slowly from his lips, and watching it as it ascended into the still air. "That blackguard Mattawa is determined not to let us off till he gets all our goods, and if he gets 'em, he may as well take our scalps too, for we would come poor speed in the prairies without guns, horses, or goods." Dick looked at his friend with an expression of concern. "What's to be done?" said he. "We must escape," answered Henry, but his tone was not a hopeful one, for he knew the danger of their position better than Dick. "Aye, we must escape. At least we must try," said Joe. "But I'll make one more effort to smooth over San Serish and get him to snub that villain Mattawa." Just as he spoke, the villain in question entered the tent with a bold, haughty air, and sat down before the fire in sullen silence. For some minutes no one spoke, and Henry, who happened at the time to be examining the locks of Dick's rifle, continued to inspect them with an appearance of careless indifference that he was far from feeling. Now this rifle of Dick's had become a source of unceasing wonder to the Indians, wonder which was greatly increased by the fact that no one could discharge it but himself. Dick had, during his short stay at the Pawnee village, amused himself and the savages by exhibiting his marvelous powers with the silver rifle. Since it had been won by him at the memorable match in the Mustang Valley, it had scarce ever been out of his hand, so that he had become decidedly the best shot in the settlement, and could bark the squirrels. That is, hit the bark of the branch on which a squirrel happened to be standing, and so kill it by the concussion alone, and could drive the nail every shot. The silver rifle, as we have said, became great medicine to the red men, when they saw it kill at a distance which the few wretched guns they had obtained from the fur traders could not even send a spent ball to. The double shot, too, filled them with wonder and admiration, but that which they regarded with an almost supernatural feeling of curiosity was the percussion cap, which in Dick's hands always exploded, but in theirs was utterly useless. This result was simply owing to the fact that Dick, after firing, handed the rifle to the Indians without renewing the cap, so that when they loaded and attempted to fire, of course it merely snapped. When he wished again to fire, he adroitly exchanged the old cap for a new one. He was immensely tickled by the solemn looks of the Indians at this most incomprehensible of all medicines, and kept them for some days in ignorance of the true case, intending to reveal it before he left. But circumstances now arose which banished all trifling thoughts from his mind. Mattawa raised his head suddenly, and said, pointing to the silver rifle, "Mattawa wishes to have the two-shotted medicine gun. He will give his best horse in exchange." "Mattawa is liberal," answered Joe, "but the pale-faced youth cannot part with it. He has far to travel, and he must shoot buffaloes by the way." "The pale-faced youth shall have a bow and arrows to shoot the buffalo," rejoined the Indian. "He cannot use the bow and arrow," exclaimed Joe. "He has not been trained like the red man." Mattawa was silent for a few seconds, and his dark brows frowned more heavily than ever over his eyes.
"The pale-faces are too bold," he exclaimed, working himself into a passion. "They are in the power of Mattawa. If they will not give him the gun, he will take it."
He sprang suddenly to his feet as he spoke, and snatched the rifle from Henry's hand. Henry, being ignorant of the language, had not been able to understand the foregoing conversation, although he saw well enough that it was not an agreeable one. But no sooner did he find himself thus rudely and unexpectedly deprived of the rifle, than he jumped up, wrenched it in a twinkling from the Indian's grasp, and hurled him violently out of the tent. In a moment Mattawa drew his knife, uttered a savage yell, and sprang on the reckless hunter, who, however, caught his wrist and held it as if in a vice. The yell brought a dozen warriors instantly to the spot, and before Dick had time to recover from his astonishment, Henry was surrounded and pinioned despite his Herculean struggles. Before Dick could move, Joe Blunt grasped his arm and whispered quickly, "Don't rise. You can't help him. They daren't kill him till San Serish agrees." Though much surprised, Dick obeyed, but it required all of his efforts, both of voice and hand, to control Crusoe, whose mind was much too honest and straightforward to understand such subtle pieces of diplomacy, and who strove to rush to the rescue of his ill-used friend. When the tumult had partially subsided, Joe Blunt rose and said, "Have the Pawnee braves turned traitors, that they draw the knife against those who have smoked with them the pipe of peace and eaten their maize? The pale-faces are 3. The Pawnees are thousands. If evil has been done, let it be laid before the chief. Mattawa wishes to have the medicine gun. Although we said no, we could not part with it. He tried to take it by force. Are we to go back to the great chief of the pale-faces and say that the Pawnees are thieves? Are the pale-faces henceforth to tell their children, when they steal, that it is bad, that it is like the Pawnee? No, this must not be. The rifle shall be restored, and we will forget this disagreement. Is it not so?" There was an evident disposition on the part of many of the Indians, with whom Mattawa was no favorite, to applaud this speech. But the wily chief sprang forward, and with flashing eye sought to turn the tables.
"The pale-face speaks with soft words, but his heart is false. Is he not going to make peace with the enemies of the Pawnee? Is he not going to take goods to them and make them gifts and promises? The pale-faces are spies, yet they come to see the weakness of the Pawnee camp. But they have found out that it is strong. Shall we suffer the false hearts to escape? Shall they live? No! We will hang their scalps in our wigwams, for they have struck a chief, and we will keep all their goods for our squaws. Wah!" This allusion to keeping all the goods had more effect on the minds of the vacillating savages than the chief's eloquence. But a new turn was given to their thoughts by Joe Blunt remarking in a quiet, almost contemptuous tone, "Mattawa is not the great chief." "True, true," they cried, and immediately hurried to the tent of San Serish. Once again this chief stood between the hunters and the savages, who wanted but a signal to fall on them. There was a long palaver, which ended in Henry being set at liberty and the rifle being restored. That evening, as the 3 friends sat beside the fire eating a supper of boiled maize and buffalo meat, they laughed as they talked as carelessly as ever, but the gaiety was assumed, for they were at the time planning their escape from a tribe which, they foresaw, would not long refrain from carrying out their wishes, and robbing, perhaps murdering them. "You see," said Joe, with a perplexed air, while he drew in a piece of live charcoal from the fire with his fingers and lighted his pipe. "You see, there's more difficulties in the way of getting off than you think." "Oh, never mind the difficulties," interrupted Henry, whose wrath at the treatment he had received had not yet cooled down. "We must jump on the best horses we can get hold, shake our fist at the red reptiles, and go away as fast as we can. The best horse must win the race." Joe shook his head. 100 arrows would be in our backs before we got 20 yards from the camp. Besides, we can't tell which are the best horses. Our own are the best in my opinion, but how are we to get 'em?" "I know who has charge of 'em,"
said Dick. "I saw 'em grazing near the tent of that poor squaw whose baby was saved by Crusoe. Either her husband looks after 'em or some neighbors." "That's well," said Joe. "That's one of my difficulties gone." "What are the others?" "Well, you see, they're troublesome. We can't get the horses out of the camp without being seen, for the red rascals would see what we were at in a jiffy. Then, if we do get 'em out, we can't go off without our bales, and we needn't think to take 'em from under the nose of the chief and his squaws without being axed questions. To go off without them would never do at all." "Joe," said Dick earnestly, "I've hit on a plan." "Have you, Dick? What is it?" "Come and I'll let ye see," answered Dick, rising hastily and quitting the tent, followed by his comrades and his faithful dog. It may be as well to remark here that no restraint whatever had yet been put on the movements of our hunters as long as they kept to their legs, for it was well known that any attempt by men on foot to escape from mounted Indians on the plains would be hopeless. Moreover, the savages thought that as long as there was a prospect of their being allowed to depart peaceably with their goods, they would not be so mad as to fly from the camp, and, by so doing, risk their lives and declare war with their entertainers. They had, therefore, been permitted to wander unchecked, as yet, far beyond the outskirts of the camp, and amuse themselves in paddling about the lake in the small Indian canoes and shooting wild fowl. Dick now led the way through the labyrinths of tents in the direction of the lake, and they talked and laughed loudly, and whistled to Crusoe as they went, in order to prevent their purpose being suspected. For the purpose of further disarming suspicion, they went without their rifles. Dick explained his plan by the way, and it was at once warmly approved by his comrades. On reaching the lake they launched a small canoe, into which Crusoe was ordered to jump. Then, embarking, they paddled swiftly to the opposite shore, singing a canoe song as they dipped their paddles in the moonlit waters of the lake. Arrived at the other side, they hauled the canoe up and hurried through the thin belt of wood and willows that intervened between the lake and the prairie. Here they paused. "Is that the bluff, Joe?" "No, Dick, that's too near. To the other one'll be the best. Far away to the right. It's a little one, and there's others near it. The sharp eyes of the redskins won't be so likely to be prowling there." "Come on, then. But we'll have to take down by the lake first." In a few minutes the hunters were threading their way through the outskirts of the woods at a rapid trot, in the opposite direction from the bluff, or wooded knoll, which they had wished to reach. This they did lest prying eyes should have followed them. In a quarter of an hour they turned at right angles to their track, and struck straight out into the prairie, and after a long run they edged round and came in upon the bluff from behind. It was merely a collection of stunted but thick growing willows. Forcing their way into the center of this, they began to examine it. "It'll do," remarked Joe. "The very thing," remarked Henri. "Come here, Crusoe." Crusoe bounded to his master's side and looked up in his face. "Look at this place, pup. Smell it well." Crusoe instantly set off all round among the willows, in and out, snuffing everywhere, and whining with excitement. "Come here, good pup, that'll do. Now, lads, we'll go back." So saying, Dick and his friends left the bluff and retraced their steps to the camp. Before they were gone, however, Joe halted and said, "You know, Dick, I doubt if the pup's so clever as ye think. What if he don't quite understand ye?" Dick replied by taking off his cap and throwing it down, at the same time exclaiming, "Take it yonder, pup," and pointing with his hand towards the bluff. The dog seized the cap and went off with it at full speed towards the willows, where it left it and came galloping back for the expected reward. Not now, as in days of old, a bit of meat, but a gentle stroke of its head and a hearty clap on its shaggy side. "Good pup! Go now and fetch it." Away he went with a bound, and in a few seconds came back and deposited the cap at his master's feet. "Will that do?" asked Dick triumphantly. "Ay, lad, it will. The pup's worth its weight in gold." "Oui, I have said, and I say it again, the dog is human, so him is. If not, fat am he." Without pausing to reply to this perplexing question, Dick stepped forward again, and in half an hour or so they were back in the camp. "Now for your part of the work, Joe. Yonder's the squaw that owns the half-drowned baby. Everything depends on her." Dick pointed to the Indian woman as he spoke. She was sitting beside her tent, and playing at her knee was the identical youngster that had been saved by Crusoe. "I'll manage it," said Joe, and walked towards her, while Dick and Henry returned to the chief's tent. "Does the Pawnee woman thank the Great Spirit that her child is saved?" began Joe as he came up.
"She does," answered the woman, looking up at the hunter, "and her heart is warm to the palefaces."
After a short silence Joe continued.
"The Pawnee chiefs do not love the palefaces. Some of them hate 'em."
"The dark flower knows it," answered the woman. "She is sorry. She would help the palefaces if she could."
This was uttered in a low tone, with a meaning glance of the eye. Joe hesitated again. Could he trust her? Yes, the feelings that filled her breast and prompted her words were not those of the Indian just now. They were those of a mother whose gratitude was too full for utterance.
"Will the dark flower," said
Joe, catching the name she had given herself,
"help the palefaces if he opens his heart to her? Will she risk the anger of her nation?"
"She will," replied the woman. "She will do what she can."
Joe and his dark friend now dropped their high-sounding style of speech and spoke for some minutes rapidly in an undertone. It was finally arranged that on a given day, at a certain hour, the woman should take the 4 horses down the shores of the lake to its lower end, as if she were going for firewood, there cross the creek at the ford, and drive them to the willow bluff, and guard them till the hunters should arrive. Having settled this, Joe returned to the tent and informed his comrades of his success. During the next 3 days Joe kept the Indians in good humor by giving them 1 or 2 trinkets, and speaking in glowing terms of the riches of the white men, and the readiness with which they would part with them to the savages if they would only make peace. Meanwhile, during the dark hours of each night, Dick managed to abstract small quantities of goods from their pack, in room of which he stuffed in pieces of leather to keep up the size and appearance. The goods thus taken out he concealed about his person, and went off with a careless swagger to the outskirts of the village, with Crusoe at his heels. Arrived there, he tied the goods in a small piece of deerskin, and gave the bundle to his dog, with the injunction, "Take it yonder, pup." Crusoe took it up at once, darted off at full speed with the bundle in his mouth, down the shore of the lake towards the ford of the river, and was soon lost to view. In this way, little by little, the goods were conveyed by the faithful dog to the willow bluff and left there, while the stuffed pack still remained in safe keeping in the chief's tent. Joe did not at first like the idea of thus sneaking off from the camp, and more than once made strong efforts to induce San it sa rish to let him go. But even that chief's countenance was not so favorable as it had been. It was clear that he could not make up his mind to let slip so good a chance of obtaining guns, powder and shot, horses and goods without any trouble, so Joe made up his mind to give them the slip at once. A dark night was chosen for the attempt, and the Indian woman went off with the horses to the place where firewood for the camp was usually cut. Unfortunately, the suspicion of that wily savage Mattawa had been awakened, and he stuck close to the hunters all day, not knowing what was going on, but feeling convinced that something was brewing which he resolved to watch, without mentioning his suspicions to anyone.
"I think the villain's away at last," whispered Joe to his comrades. "It's time to go now, lads. The moon won't be up for an hour. Come along."
"Have ye got the big powder horn, Joe?"
"Aye, aye, all right."
Stop, my knife, my catoo. Ah, here it is." The 3 set off as usual, strolling carelessly to the outskirts of the camp. Then they quickened their pace, and gaining the lake, pushed off in a small canoe. At the same time Mattawa stepped from the bushes, leaped into another canoe, and followed them.
"Ha! He must die," muttered Henry.
"Not at all," said
Joe.
"We'll manage him without that."
The chief landed and strode boldly up to them, for he knew well that whatever their purpose might be, they would not venture to use their rifles within the sound of the camp at the hour of the night. As for their knives, he could trust his own active limbs and the woods to escape and give the alarm if need be.
"The pale faces hunt very late," he said with a malicious grin. "Do they love the dark better than the sunshine?"
"Not so," replied Joe coolly, "but we love to walk by the light of the moon. It'll be up in less than an hour, and we mean to take a long ramble tonight."
"The Pawnee chief loves to walk by the moon, too. He will go with the pale faces."
"Good!" ejaculated Joe. "Come along then."
The party immediately set forward, although the savage was a little taken by surprise at the indifferent way in which Joe received his proposal to accompany them. He walked on to the edge of the prairie, however, and then stopped.
"The pale faces must go alone," he said. "Mattawa will return to his tent."
Joe replied to this intimation by seizing him suddenly by the throat and choking back the yell that would have otherwise brought the Pawnee warriors rushing to the scene of action in hundreds. Mattawa's hand was on the handle of his scalping knife in a moment, but before he could draw it, his arms were glued to his sides by the bear-like embrace of Henri, while Dick tied a handkerchief quickly yet firmly round his mouth. The whole thing was accomplished in 2 minutes. After taking his knife and tomahawk away, they loosened their grip and escorted him swiftly over the prairie. Mattawa was perfectly submissive after the first convulsive struggle was over. He knew that the men who walked on each side of him grasping his arms were more than his match singly, so he wisely made no resistance. Hurrying him to a clump of small trees on the plain, which was so far distant from the village that a yell could not be heard, they removed the bandage from Mattawa's mouth. "Must he be killed?" inquired Henri in a tone of commiseration.
"Not at all," answered Joe. "We'll tie him to a tree and leave him there."
"Then he will be starved to death. Oh, that is more horrible."
"He must take his chance of that. I've no doubt his friends will find him in a day or two, and he's game to last for a week or more. But you'll have to run to the Willow Bluff, Dick, and bring a bit of line to tie him with. We can't spare it well, but there's no help."
"But there is help," retorted Dick. "Just order the villain to climb into that tree."
"Why so, lad?"
"Don't ask questions, but do what I bid ye." The hunter smiled for a moment as he turned to the Indian and ordered him to climb up a small tree near to which he stood. Mattawa looked surprised, but there was no alternative. Joe's authoritative tone brooked no delay, so he sprang into the tree like a monkey. "Crusoe," said Dick, "watch him." The dog sat down quietly at the foot of the tree and fixed his eyes on the savage with a glare that spoke unutterable things. At the same time he displayed his full complement of teeth and uttered a sound like distant thunder. Joe almost laughed, and Henri did laugh outright. "Come along, he's safe now," cried Dick, hurrying away in the direction of the Willow Bluff, which they soon reached, and found that the faithful squaw had tied their steeds to the bushes, and moreover had bundled up their goods into a pack and strapped it on the back of the pack horse, but she had not remained with them.
"Bless your dark face!"
ejaculated Joe as he sprang into the saddle and rode out the clump of bushes. He was followed immediately by the others, and in 3 minutes they were flying over the plain at full speed. On gaining the last far-off ridge that afforded a distant view of the woods skirting the Pawnee camp, they drew up, and Dick, putting his fingers to his mouth, drew a long, shrill whistle. It reached the Willow Bluff like a faint echo. At the same time the moon arose and more clearly revealed Crusoe's cataleptic glare at the Indian chief, who, being utterly unarmed, was at the dog's mercy. The instant the whistle fell on his ear, however, he dropped his eyes, covered his teeth, and, leaping through the bushes, flew over the plains like an arrow. At the same instant Mattawa, descending from his tree, ran as fast as he could towards the village, uttering the terrible war whoop when near enough to be heard. No sound sends such a thrill through an Indian camp. Every warrior flew to arms and vaulted on his steed. So quickly was the alarm given that in less than 10 minutes 1,000 hoofs were thundering on the plain and faintly reached the ears of the fugitives. Joe smiled.
It'll puzzle them to come up with nags like ours. They're in prime condition, too. Lots of wind in 'em. If we only keep out of badger holes, we may laugh at the red varmints."
Joe's opinion of Indian horses was correct. In a very few minutes the sound of hoofs died away, but the fugitives did not draw bridle during the remainder of that night, for they knew not how long the pursuit might be continued. By pond and brook and bluff they passed, down in the grassy bottoms and over the prairie waves, nor checked their headlong course till the sun blazed over the level sweep of the eastern plain as if it arose out of the mighty ocean. Then they sprang from the saddle and hastily set about the preparation of their morning meal. Chapter 11. Of the Dog Crusoe and His Master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 11. Evening Meditations and Morning Reflections. Buffalo, Badgers, Antelopes, and Accidents. An Old Bull and the Wolves. Mad Tales. Henry floored, etc., etc. There is nothing that prepares one so well for the enjoyment of rest, both mental and physical, as a long protracted period of excitement and anxiety, followed up by bodily fatigue. Excitement alone banishes rest, but, united with severe physical exertion, it prepares for it. At least, courteous reader, this is our experience, and certainly this was the experience of our 3 hunters as they lay on their backs beneath the branches of a willow bush, and gazed serenely up at the twinkling stars, 2 days after their escape from the Indian village. They spoke little. They were too tired for that. Also, they were too comfortable. Their respective suppers of fresh antelope steak, shot that day, had just been disposed of. Their feet were directed towards the small fire on which the said steaks had been cooked, and which still threw a warm ruddy glow over the encampment. Their blankets were wrapped comfortably round them, and tucked in only as hunters and mothers know how to tuck them in. Their respective pipes delivered forth, at stated intervals, 3 richly yellow puffs of smoke, as if a 3-gun battery were playing upon the sky from that particular spot of earth. The horses were picketed and hobbled in a rich grassy bottom close by, from which the quiet munch of their equine jaws sounded pleasantly, for it told of healthy appetites, and promised speed on the morrow. The fear of being overtaken during the night was now past, and the faithful Crusoe, by virtue of sight, hearing, and smell, guaranteed them against sudden attack during the hours of slumber. A perfume of wild flowers mingled with the loved odors of the weed, and the tinkle of a tiny rivulet fell sweetly on their ears. In short, the pale faces were supremely happy, and disposed to be thankful for their recent deliverance and the present comforts. "I wonder what the stars are," said Dick, languidly taking the pipe out of his mouth. "Bits of fire," suggested Joe. "I tink dey are worlds," muttered Henry, "and have peoples in dem. I hear men say dat." A long silence followed, during which, no doubt, the star gazers were working out various theories in their own mind. "Wonder," said Dick again, "how far off they may be."
"A mile or 2, maybe,"
said Joe. Henry was about to laugh sarcastically at this, but on further consideration he thought it would be more comfortable not to, so he lay still. In another minute he said, "Joe Blunt, you is ver ignorant. Don't you know dat de books say de stars be hundreds, thousands, millions of mile away to here, and dat dey is more bigger dan dis world?" Joe snored lightly, and his pipe fell out of his mouth at this point, so the conversation dropped. Presently Dick asked in a low tone, "I say, Henry, are ye 'sleep?" "Oui," replied Henry faintly. Don't speak, or you will waken me." "Ah, Crusoe, you're not asleep, are you, pup?" No need to ask that question. The instantaneous wag of that speaking tail and the glance of that wakeful eye as the dog lifted his head and lay his chin on Dick's arm, showed that he had been listening to every word that was spoken. We cannot say whether he understood it, but beyond all doubt he heard it. Crusoe never presumed to think of going to sleep until his master was as sound as a top. Then he ventured to indulge in that light species of slumber which is familiarly known as sleeping with one eye open. But comparatively as well as figuratively speaking, Crusoe slept usually with one eye and a half open, and the other half was never very tightly shut. Gradually Dick's pipe fell out of his mouth, an event which the dog, with an exercise of instinct almost, if not quite, amounting to reason, regarded as a signal for him to go off. The camp fire went slowly out, the stars twinkled down at their reflections in the brook, and a deep breathing of wearied men was the only sound that rose in harmony with the purling stream. Before the sun rose next morning, and while many of the brighter stars were still struggling for existence with the approaching day, Joe was up and buckling on the saddle bags, while he shouted to his unwilling companions to rise.
"If it depended on you," he said, "the ponies wouldn't be long afore they got our scalps. Jump, you dogs, and lend a hand, will you?"
A snore from Dick and a deep sigh from Henry was the answer to this pathetic appeal. It so happened, however, that Henry's pipe, in falling from his lips, had emptied the ashes just under his nose, so that the sigh referred to drew a quantity thereof into his throat and almost choked him. Nothing could have been a more effective awakener. He was up in a moment, coughing vociferously. Most men have a tendency to vent ill humor on some one, and they generally do it on one whom they deem to be worse than themselves. Henry, therefore, instead of growling at Joe for rousing him, scolded Dick for not rising.
"Ha, malvaise dog, bad chin, will you dare to look at me?"
Crusoe did with amiable placidity, as though to say,
"Howl away, old boy, I won't budge till Dick does."
With a mighty effort Giant Sleep was thrown off at last, and the hunters were once more on their journey, cantering lightly over the soft turf. "Ho! Let's have a run!" cried Dick, unable to repress his feelings aroused by the exhilarating morning air.
"Have a care, boy,"
cried Joe, as they stretched out at full gallop.
"Keep off the ridge. It's riddled with badger. Ha! I thought so."
At that moment Dick's horse put its foot into a badger hole and turned completely over, sending its rider through the air in a curve that an East Indian acrobat would have envied. For a few seconds Dick lay flat on his back. Then he jumped up and laughed, while his comrades hurried up anxiously to his assistance.
"No bones broke?"
inquired Joe. Dick gave a hysterical gasp. I think not."
"Let's have a look. No, nothing to speak of. Be good luck. Ye should never go slap through a badger country like that, boy. Always keepin' to bottoms where the grass is short. Now then, up you go. That's it."
Dick remounted, though not with quite so elastic a spring as usual, and they pushed forward at a more reasonable pace. Accidents of this kind are of common occurrence in the prairies. Some horses, however, are so well trained that they look sharp out for these holes, which are generally found to be most numerous on the high and dry grounds. But in spite of all the caution both of man and horse, many ugly falls take place, and sometimes bones are broken. They had not gone far after this accident when an antelope leaped from a clump of willows and made for a belt of woodland that lay along the margin of a stream not half a mile off. "Hurray!" cried Dick, forgetting his recent fall. "Come along, Crusoe!" And away they went again full tilt, for the horse had not been injured by its somersault. The antelope which Dick was thus wildly pursuing was of the same species as the one he had shot some time before, namely, the prong horned antelope. These graceful creatures have long, slender limbs, delicately formed heads, and large, beautiful eyes. The horns are black and rather short. They have no branches like the antlers of the red deer, but have a single projection on each horn near the head, and the extreme points of the horns curve suddenly inwards, forming the hook or prong from which the name of the animal is derived. Their color is dark yellowish brown. They are so fleet that not one horse in 100 can overtake them, and their sight and sense of smell are so acute that it would be next to impossible to kill them, were it not for the inordinate curiosity which we have before referred to. The Indians manage to attract these simple little creatures by merely lying down on their backs and kicking their heels in the air, or by waving any white object on the point of an arrow, while the hunter keeps concealed by lying flat in the grass. By these means a herd of antelopes may be induced to wheel around and round an object in timid but intense surprise, gradually approaching until they come near enough to enable the hunter to make sure of his mark. Thus the animals, which of all others ought to be the most difficult to slay, are in consequence of their insatiable curiosity more easily shot than any other deer of the plains. May we not gently suggest to the reader for his or her consideration that there are human antelopes, so to speak, whose case bears a striking resemblance to the pronghorn of the North American prairie? Dick's horse was no match for the antelope. Neither was Crusoe, so they pulled up shortly and returned to their companions to be laughed at.
"It's no manner of use to wind your horse, lad, after sich a game. They're not much worth, and, if I mistake not, we'll be among buffalo soon. There's fresh tracks everywhere, and the herds are now scattered. You see, when they keep together in the bands of thousands, you don't so often fall in with 'em. But when they scatters about in 2s and 3s and 6s, you may shoot them every day as much as you please."
Several groups of buffalo had already been seen on the horizon, but as a red deer had been shot in a belt of woodland the day before, they did not pursue them. The red deer is very much larger than the prong-horned antelope, and is highly esteemed both for its flesh and its skin, which latter becomes almost like chamois leather when dressed. Notwithstanding this supply of food, the hunters could not resist the temptation to chase to a herd of about 9 buffaloes that suddenly came into view as they overtopped an undulation in the plain. "It's no use," cried Dick. "I must go at 'em." Joe himself caught fire from the spirit of his young friend, so calling to Henry to come on and let the pack horse remain to feed, he dashed away in pursuit. The buffalo gave one stare of surprise, and then fled as fast as possible. At first it seemed as if a huge unwieldy carcass could not run very fast, but in a few minutes they managed to get up a pace that put the horses to their mettle. Indeed, at first it seemed as if the hunters did not gain an inch, but by degrees they closed with them, for buffaloes are not long-winded. On nearing the herd, the 3 men diverged from each other and selected their animals. Henry, being short-sighted, naturally singled out the largest, and the largest, also naturally, was a tough old bull. Joe brought down a fat young cow at the first shot, and Dick was equally fortunate, but he well nigh shot Crusoe, who, just as he was about to fire, rushed in unexpectedly and sprang at the animal's throat, for which piece of recklessness he was ordered back to watch the pack horse. Meanwhile Henry, by dint of yelling, throwing his arms wildly about, and digging his heels into the side of his long-legged horse, succeeded in coming close up with the bull, which once or twice turned his clumsy body half round and glared furiously at his pursuer with its small black eyes. Suddenly it stuck out its tail, stopped short, and turned full round. Henry stopped short also. Now the sticking out of a buffalo's tail has peculiar significance, which is well to point out. It serves, in a sense, the same purpose to the hunter that the compass does to the mariner. It points out where to go and what to do. When galloping away in ordinary flight, the buffalo carries his tail like ordinary cattle, which indicates that you may push on. When wounded, he lashes it from side to side, or carries it over his back, up in the air. This indicates, "Look out! Haul off a bit!" But when he carries it stiff and horizontal, with a slight curve in the middle of it, it says plainly, "Keep back, or kill me as quick as you can," for that is what Indians call the "mad lazy," and is a sign that mischief is brewing. Henry's bull displayed the "mad tail" just before turning, but he didn't observe it, and accordingly waited for the bull to move and show his shoulder for a favorable shot. But instead of doing this, he put his head down, and, foaming with rage, went at him full tilt. The big horse never stirred. It seemed to be petrified. Henry had just time to fire at the monster's neck, and the next moment was sprawling on his back, with the horse rolling over 4 or 5 yards beyond him. It was a most effective tableau, Henry rubbing his shins and grinning with pain, the horse gazing in affright as he rose trembling from the plain, and the buffalo bull looking on half stunned and, evidently, very much surprised at the result of his charge. Fortunately, before he could repeat the experiment, Dick galloped up and put a ball through his heart. Joe and his comrades felt a little ashamed of their exploit on this occasion, for there was no need to have killed 3 animals. They could not have carried with them more than a small portion of one, and they upbraided themselves several times during the operation of cutting out the tongues and other choice portions of the 2 victims. As for the bull, he was almost totally useless, so they left him as a gift to the wolves. Now that they had come upon the buffalo, wolves were often seen sneaking about and licking their hungry jaws, but although they approached pretty near to the camp at nights, they did not give the hunters any concern. Even Crusoe became accustomed to them at last, and ceased to notice them. These creatures are very dangerous sometimes, however, and when hard pressed by hunger will even attack man. The day after this hunt the travelers came upon a wounded old buffalo, which had evidently escaped from the Indians, for a couple of arrows were sticking in its side, only to fall prey to his deadly enemies, the white wolves. These savage brutes hang on the skirts of the herds of buffaloes to attack and devour any one that may chance, from old age or from being wounded, to linger behind the rest. The buffalo is tough and fierce, however, and fights so desperately that although surrounded by 50 or 100 wolves, he keeps up the unequal combat for several days before he finally succumbs. The old bull that our travelers discovered had evidently been long engaged with his ferocious adversaries, for his limbs and flesh were torn in shreds in many places, and blood was streaming from his sides. Yet he had fought so gallantly that he had tossed and stamped to death dozens of the enemy. There could not have been fewer than 50 wolves round him, and they had just concluded another of many futile attacks when the hunters came up, for they were ranged in a circle round their huge adversary, some lying down, some sitting on their haunches to rest, and others sneaking about, lolling out their red tongues and licking their chops as if impatient to renew the combat. The poor buffalo was nearly spent, and it was clear that a few hours more would see him torn to shreds and his bones picked clean. "Ugh! de brutes!" ejaculated Henry. "They don't seem to mind us a bit," remarked Dick, as they rode up to within pistol shot. "It'll be merciful to give the old fellow a shot," said Joe. "Them varmints are sure to finish him at last." Joe raised his rifle as he spoke, and fired. The old bull gave his last groan and fell, while the wolves, alarmed by the shot, fled in all directions. But they did not run far. They knew well that some portion, at least, of the carcass would fall to their share, so they sat down at various distances all around to wait as patiently as they might for the hunters to retire. Dick left the scene with a feeling of regret that the villainous wolves should have their feast so much sooner than they expected. Yet, after all, why should we call these wolves villainous? They did nothing wrong, nothing contrary to the laws of their peculiar nature. Nay, if we come to reason upon it, they rank higher in this matter than man. For while the wolf does no violence to the laws of its instincts, man often deliberately silences the voice of conscience, and violates the laws of his own nature. But we will not insist on the term, good reader, if you object strongly to it. We are willing to admit that wolves are not villainous, but assuredly they are unlovable. In the course of the afternoon the 3 horsemen reached a small creek, the banks of which were lined with a few stunted shrubs and trees. Having eaten nothing since the night before, they dismounted here to feed, as Joe expressed it. "Cur'ous thing," remarked Joe, as he struck a light by means of flint, steel, and tinder box.
Curious thing that we're made to need sich a lot of grub. If we could only get on like the sarpents, now, what can breakfast on a rabbit, then wait a month or two for dinner? Ain't it cur'us?"
Dick admitted that it was, and stooped to blow the fire into a blaze. Here Henry uttered a cry of consternation, and stood speechless with his mouth open. "What's the matter? What is it?" cried Dick and Joe, seizing their rifles instinctively. "De grub him be forgot." There was a look of blank horror, and then a burst of laughter from Dick Varley. "Well, well," cried he, "we've got lots of tea and sugar and some flour. We can get on with that till we shoot another buffalo, or aha!" Dick observed a wild turkey stalking among the willows as he spoke. It was fully 100 yards off, and only its head was seen above the leaves. This was a matter of little moment, however, for by aiming a little lower he knew that he must hit the body. But Dick had driven the nail too often to aim at its body. He aimed at the bird's eye and cut its head off. "Fetch it, Crusoe." In 3 minutes it was at Dick's feet, and it is not too much to say that in 5 minutes more it was in the pot. As this unexpected supply made up for the loss of the meat which Henry had forgotten at their last halting place, their equanimity was restored, and while the meal was in preparation, Dick shouldered his rifle and went into the bush to try for another turkey. He did not get one, however, but he shot a couple of prairie hens, which are excellent eating. Moreover, he found a large quantity of wild grapes and plums. These were unfortunately not nearly ripe, but Dick resolved to try his hand at a new dish, so he stuffed the breast of his coat full of them. After the pot was emptied, Dick washed it out and put a little clean water in it. Then he poured some flour in and stirred it well. While this was heating he squeezed the sour grapes and the plums into what Joe called a mush, and mixed it with a spoonful of sugar, and emptied it into the pot. He also skimmed a quantity of the fat from the remains of the turkey soup, and added that to the mess, which he stirred with earnest diligence till it boiled down into a sort of thick porridge.
"Do you think it'll be good?" asked Joe gravely. "I've me doubts of it."
"We'll see. Hold the tin dish, Henry. Take care of de fingers. Ha! It looks magnificent. Superb!" The first spoonful produced an expression on Henry's face that needed not to be interpreted. It was as sour as vinegar.
"You'll have to eat it yourself, Dick lad," cried Joe, throwing down his spoon and spitting out the unsavory mess.
"Nonsense!" cried Dick, bolting 2 or 3 mouthfuls and trying to look as if he liked it. "Try again. It's not so bad as you think." "Ho!" cried Henry after the second mouthful. "'Tis vinegar. All de sugar in de pack would not make more sweeter one bite of it." Dick was obliged to confess the dish a failure, so it was thrown out after having been offered to Crusoe, who gave it one sniff and turned away in silence. Then they mounted and resumed their journey. At this place mosquitoes and horseflies troubled our hunters and their steeds a good deal. The latter, especially, were very annoying to the poor horses. They bit them so much that the blood at last came trickling down their sides. They were troubled, also, once or twice, by cockchafers and locusts, which annoyed them, not indeed by biting, but by flying blindly against their faces, and often narrowly missed hitting them in the eyes. Once particularly they were so bad that Henry in his wrath opened his lips to pronounce a malediction on the whole race, when a cockchafer flew straight into his mouth, and, to use his own forcible expression, nearly knocked him off the hoss. But these were minor evils, and scarcely cost the hunters a thought. Chapter 12. Of A Dog Crusoe and His Master. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Dog Crusoe and His Master by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 12. Wanderings on the Prairie. A War Party. Chased by Indians. A Bold Leap for Life. For many days the three hunters wandered over the trackless prairie in search of a village of the Sioux Indians, but failed to find one, for the Indians were in the habit of shifting their ground and following the buffalo. Several times they saw small isolated bands of Indians, but these they carefully avoided, fearing they might turn out to be war parties, and if they fell into their hands, the white men could not expect civil treatment, whatever nations the Indians might belong to. During the greater portion of this time they met with numerous herds of buffalo and deer, and were well supplied with food. But they had to cook it during the day, being afraid to light a fire at night while Indians were prowling about. One night they halted near the bed of a stream which was almost dry. They had traveled a day and a night without water, and both men and horses were almost choking, so that when they saw the trees on the horizon, which indicated the presence of a stream, they pushed forward with almost frantic haste.
"Hope it's not dry,"
said Joe anxiously as they galloped up to it.
"No, there's water, lads,"
and they dashed forward to a pool that had not yet been dried up. They drank long and eagerly before they noticed that the pool was strongly impregnated with salt. Many streams in those parts of the prairies are quite salty, but fortunately this one was not utterly undrinkable, though it was very unpalatable.
"We'll make it better, lads,"
said Joe, digging a deep hole in the sand with his hands, a little below the pool. In a short time the water filtered through, and though not rendered fresh, it was, nevertheless, much improved. "We may light a fire to-night, d'ye think?" inquired Dick. "We've not seed Injuns for some days."
"Perhaps 'twouldn't be better not," said Joe, "but I dare say we safe enough."
A fire therefore was lighted in as sheltered a spot as could be found, and the three friends bivouacked as usual. Towards dawn they were aroused by an angry growl from Crusoe. "It's a wolf, likely," said Dick, but all three seized and cocked their rifles nevertheless. Again Crusoe growled more angrily than before, and springing out of the camp snuffed the breeze anxiously.
"Up, lads! Catch the nags! There's somethin' in the wind, for the dog never did that afore."
In a few seconds the horses were saddled and the pack secured.
"Call in the dog," whispered Joe Blunt. "If he barks, they'll find out our whereabouts."
"Here, Crusoe, come!" It was too late. The dog barked loudly and savagely at the moment, and a troop of Indians came coursing over the plain. On hearing the unwonted sound, they wheeled directly and made for the camp.
"It's a war party, lads! Fly! Nothin'll save our scalps now but our horses' heels,"
cried Joe. In a moment they vaulted into the saddle and urged their steeds forward at the utmost speed. The savages observed them, and with an exulting yell dashed after them. Feeling that there was now no need of concealment, the three horsemen struck off into the open prairie, intending to depend entirely on the speed and stamina of their horses. As we have before remarked, they were good ones, but the Indians soon proved that they were equally well, if not better, mounted.
"It'll be a hard run,"
said Joe in a low muttering tone, and then looked furtively over his shoulder.
"The varmints are mounted on wild hosses. Leastways, they were wild not long gone. Them chaps can throw the lasso and trip a mustang as well as a Mexican. Mind the badger holes, Dick. Hold in a bit, Henry. Your nag don't need a driving. A foot in the hole just now would cost us our scalps. Keep down by the creek, lads."
"Ha! How dey yell!" said Henry in a savage tone, looking back and shaking his rifle at them, an act that caused them to yell more fiercely than ever. "Dis old pack hoss give me much trouble." The pace was now tremendous. Pursuers and pursued rose and sank on the prairie billows as they swept along, till they came to what is termed a dividing ridge, which is a cross wave, as it were, which cuts the other in two, thus forming a continuous level. Here they advanced more easily, but the advantage was equally shared with their pursuers. who continued the headlong pursuit with occasional yells which served to show the fugitives that they at least did not gain ground. A little to the right of the direction in which they were flying, a blue line was seen on the horizon. This indicated the existence of trees to Joe's practiced eyes, and feeling that if the horses broke down they could better make a last manful stand in the wood than on the plains, he urged his steed towards it. The savages noticed the movement at once, and uttered a yell of exultation, for they regarded it as an evidence that the fugitives doubted the strength of their horses.
"You haven't got us yet,"
muttered Joe, with a sardonic grin.
"If they get near us, Dick, keep your eyes open, and look out for your neck, else they'll drop a noose over it, they will, afore you know they're near, and haul you off like a sack."
Dick nodded in reply, but did not speak, for at that moment his eye was fixed on a small creek ahead which they must necessarily leap or dash across. It was lined with clumps of scattered shrubbery, and he glanced rapidly for the most suitable place to pass. Joe and Henri did the same, and having diverged a little to the different points chosen, they dashed through the shrubbery and were hid from each other's view. On approaching the edge of the stream, Dick found to his consternation that the bank was 20 feet high opposite him, and too wide for any horse to clear. Wheeling aside without checking speed, at the risk of throwing his steed, he rode along the margin of the stream for a few hundred yards, until he found a ford, at least such a spot as might be cleared by a bold leap. The temporary check, however, had enabled an Indian to gain so close upon his heels that his exulting yell sounded close in his ear. With a vigorous bound his gallant little horse went over. Crusoe could not take it, but he rushed down the one bank and up the other, so that he only lost a few yards. These few yards, however, were sufficient to bring the Indian close upon him as he cleared the stream at full gallop. The savage whirled his lasso swiftly round for a second, and in another moment Crusoe uttered a tremendous roar as he was tripped up violently on the plain. Dick heard the cry of his faithful dog, and turned quickly round, just in time to see him spring at the horse's throat, and bring both steed and rider down upon him. Dick's heart leaped to his throat. Had 1,000 savages been rushing on him, he would have flown to the rescue of his favorite. But an unexpected obstacle came in the way. His fiery little steed, excited by the headlong race and howls of the Indians, had taken the bit in his teeth, and was now unmanageable. He tore at the reins like a maniac, and in the height of his frenzy even raised the butt of his rifle with the intent to strike the poor horse to the earth. But his better nature prevailed. He checked the uplifted hand, and with a groan dropped the reins, and sank almost helplessly forward on the saddle, for several of the Indians had left the main body and were pursuing him alone, so that there would have now been no chance of his reaching the place where Crusoe fell, even if he could have turned his horse. Spiritless and utterly indifferent to what his fate might be, Dick Varley rode along with his head drooping, and keeping his seat almost mechanically, while the mettlesome little steed flew on over wave and hollow. Gradually he awakened from this state of despair to a sense of danger. Glancing round, he observed that the Indians were now far behind him, though still pursuing. He also observed that his companions were galloping miles away on the horizon to the left, and that he had foolishly allowed the savages to get between him and them. The only chance that remained for him was to outride his pursuers and circle round towards his comrades, and this he hoped to accomplish, for his little horse had now proved itself to be superior to those of the Indians, and there was good running in him still. Urging him forward, therefore, he soon left the savages still further behind, and feeling confident that they could not now overtake him, he reined up and dismounted. The pursuers quickly drew near, but short though it was, the rest did the horse good. Vaulting into the saddle, he again stretched out, and now skirted along the margin of a wood which seemed to mark the position of a river of considerable size. At this moment his horse put his foot into a badger hole, and both of them came heavily to the ground. In an instant Dick rose, picked up his gun, and leaped unhurt into the saddle. But on urging his poor horse forward, he found that its shoulder was badly sprained. There was no room for mercy, however. Life and death were in the balance. So he plied the lash vigorously, and the noble steed warmed into something like a run, when again it stumbled and fell with a crash on the ground, while the blood burst from its mouth and nostrils. Dick could hear the shout of triumph uttered by his pursuers. "My poor, poor horse!" he exclaimed in a tone of the deepest commiseration, while he stopped and stroked its foam-studded neck. The dying steed raised his head for a moment. It almost seemed as if to acknowledge the tones of affection. Then it sank down with a gurgling groan. Dick sprang up, for the Indians were now upon him, and bounded like an antelope into the thickest of the shrubbery, which was nowhere thick enough, however, to prevent the Indians following. Still it sufficiently retarded them to render the chase a more equal one than could have been expected. In a few minutes Dick gained a strip of open ground beyond, and found himself on the bank of a broad river, whose evidently deep waters rushed impetuously along their unobstructed channel. The bank at the spot where he reached it was a sheer precipice of between 30 and 40 feet high. Glancing up and down the river, he retreated a few paces, turned round, and shook his clenched fists at the savages, accompanying the action with a shout of defiance, and then, running to the edge of the bank, sprang far out into the boiling flood and sank. The Indians pulled up on reaching the spot. There was no possibility of galloping down the wood-encumbered banks after the fugitive, but, quick as thought, each red man leaped to the ground, and fitting an arrow to his bow, awaited Dick's reappearance with eager gaze. Young though he was, and unskilled in such warfare, Dick knew well enough what sort of reception he would meet with on coming to the surface. So he kept under the water as long as he could, and struck out as vigorously as the care of his rifle would permit. At last he rose for a few seconds, and immediately half a dozen arrows whizzed through the air, but most of them fell short. Only one passed close to his cheek, and went with a whip into the river. He immediately sank again, and the next time he rose to breathe, he was far beyond the reach of his Indian enemies. Chapter 13.